response to the tragic killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others, too many others. The series expanded over time to explore systemic racism as it affects all areas of law and communities of color in the United States. Now, the 2 years since 2020, since we began the lecture series, we brought even greater awareness of racial injustice in the United States. We are continually reminded of racial injustice in the United States. We have painful, almost daily reminders of the systemic racial injustice in the United States. Public officials aren't immune from this, whether they're governors who ship immigrants from their jurisdictions to other jurisdictions, or city council members, unfortunately my hometown, who spout bigotry in jest behind closed doors. And we're very fortunate to have an expert today talk about the power and persistence of racism. So please welcome Professor Deborah Archer.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the generous introduction and the welcome. I've been a fan of your scholarship and your leadership, Dean Johnson, for a very long time. And I think UC Davis School of Law is lucky to have such a transformational and dynamic leader. Thank you for inviting me to deliver the Barrett Lecture. And I'm especially excited to talk to you about racism, the power and persistence of racism, and especially anti-Black racism in particular. The twin horrors of 2020, the murder of George Floyd at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and the ravaging of Black communities by COVID-19 introduced into a society and systems that are racially discriminatory in individual, institutional, and structural ways, really put the violence of racism in all its forms on full display. And for a surprisingly large number of people, these tragedies, I am battling a cold. I just took some Dayquil. I think it's kicking in. So please forgive me. For a lot of people, these tragedies were a shock to the system. It was an education for them in American racism. Yet many of us know that while the murder of George Floyd and the racial impact of the pandemic made news, nothing about either of those things was new. We know that over centuries, America has created a system where wealth, opportunity, education, health, safety are all inequitably distributed on the basis of race. We know that our society has embedded racial inequality and white supremacy into our laws, policies, practices, our institutions, our physical environment, the narratives we tell, and our cultural norms to form what I call the infrastructure of racial inequality. And in 2020, in 2021, and still today in 2022, we are seeing that infrastructure do its work. In 1857, in Dred Scott versus Sanford, the United States Supreme Court proclaimed that Black people possess, quote, no rights or privileges beyond what white men might choose to grant them. And so much of American history can still be understood through that lens. American institutions, the laws, and our cultural norms have developed as tools to subjugate, to control, to regulate, to devalue Black people. And although formal slavery ended with the adoption of the 13th Amendment in 1865, lynchings continued until 1968, and they have both been replaced with new tools, often state authorized or state enabled, to continue to enforce racial order, tools that have continued to adapt and evolve over time. Slavery gave way to convict leasing systems, to Jim Crow, to racial segregation and the theft of Black land and property. The brutal physical abuse of Black people, often inflicted publicly, remains central to the maintenance of white supremacy, is on full display in the incidents of racialized police violence that we continue to see. Indeed, the infrastructure of racial inequality is working exactly as it was designed to work. In communities of color around the country, racism can be all-encompassing. And for many Black people in the United States, it can be hard to escape racism's brutal grasp. But this current moment is not unprecedented. Every generation has experienced the rage, the urgency, the anger, and exhaustion that drive demands for change like we are seeing now. Every generation has collectively and publicly grieved racialized brutality. and the loss of Black lives. And every generation has viscerally been reminded of racism's grinding pain. And every generation is reminded that our systems are all still founded on that white supremacist belief that Black people have no rights or privileges beyond those that white people might choose to grant them. And as we are forced to confront, once again, the truth of who we are and how we got here, I want to share some thoughts for how I understand how racism persists in its power and how we can challenge that power. At the ACLU, we say that we are fighting for an America where we, the people, means all of us. And for me, what is so stunning about America, so heartbreaking, is how America resists closing that gap, how racism persists, how racism's power is in its ability to evolve because it's creative, because it knows how to adapt. America ratified the 15th Amendment and guarantees Black men the right to vote. And then America responds with poll taxes and grandfather clauses and voter ID laws. America makes Jim Crow and housing discrimination illegal. And then America responds with redlining and racially exclusionary housing policies, the criminalization of poverty and living while Black. America makes slavery illegal. And then America responds with mass incarceration and police brutality and racial terror. In his famous poem, Let America Be America Again, Langston Hughes wrote, "Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet and yet must be. The land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me." I think this is our constant struggle. We have to continue the fight to make America be America. And today, as we are having long overdue conversations about racial inequality, the question we have to ask is whether the conversations we're having will finally transform our country in meaningful ways. And unfortunately, I fear that change is going to be limited. We are still too often looking in the wrong places and asking the wrong questions, which lead us to the wrong answers. We're focused on specific acts of injustice before us and thinking that we've corrected the problem when we address this individual wrong and feeling like we have solved all of our racial problems when we hold one person accountable. But the actions of an individual bad guy, even when their evil is caught on camera for the world to see, that's not the full story of racism. This understanding of racism overlooks the centuries-long impact of race-based laws, facially neutral laws, and policies and practices that have caused and perpetuate racial inequality. And that limited understanding means that we're using tools that are too small and too narrow to be effective. It means that we are not acting in ways that fully challenge racism's power and persistence to exclude and destroy. So what can we do to challenge the racism and inequality that is woven into our systems and our structures? First, I think we need to reconcile with the past. Over the last couple of years, we have been in what people are calling a racial reckoning, and we're beginning to shine a light on the practices that are not only a part of America's racist past, but that remain central to America's present dehumanization of people of color, particularly Black bodies, Black community, and Black identity. And by calling out the breadth of America's sins against Black people, we as a country were engaged in critical conversations about how to challenge that architecture, that infrastructure of racial inequality, and finally locate the source of Black America's problems, not just in Black people, but in the racism that's woven into our country, woven into the fabric of America. One of the classes that I teach at NYU Law School is critical race theory. And critical race theory teaches us that when it comes to racial justice, progress is always met with retrenchment. And advance is always met with resistance. So Reconstruction led to Jim Crow, the Civil Rights era led to the Reagan era, the election of Barack Obama led to the election of Donald Trump. Record political participation by Black voters has led to systemic disenfranchisement. So we should not at all be surprised that we are in a time of resistance and retrenchment. If 2020 was this year of racial reckoning, 2021 and 2022 are both shaping up to be years of retrenchment. And it is beyond ironic to me that much of that retrenchment is taking the form of so-called bans on critical race theory, the very framework that helps us understand why we're here in the first place, why this process continues to happen. And this country is forced to confront once again the truth of who we are, how we got here, the challenges to critical race theory have emerged as a nationwide effort to stop and censor conversations about race. In The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin posits that true racial justice has been halted because people are, quote, in effect still trapped in a history which they do not understand, and until they understand it, they cannot be released from it. The power of racism rests in part on ignorance. You cannot change what you don't understand. So CRT began as a school of legal scholarship that produced a framework for understanding the law's role in enduring racial inequality and the relationship between race, racism, and power to understand the problem in order to intervene in it and transform it. But now CRT has been recast as this evil ideology that is anti-American and anti-white. In truth, this is part of a systemic effort to reverse the racial reckoning, to restore the status quo, to recast anti-racism as racism, and to stop meaningful conversations about racial equality. So rather than engage with conversations about structural racism, we now have a wave of lawmakers who are seeking to silence individuals, educators, young people, and to impose an alternate version of our American history, one that erases the legacy and reality of racial oppression. But the roots of racism in 2022 often have a direct line to the racist policies and practices of the past. And we can't dismantle racism today unless we take the time to acknowledge and explore those connections. You can't have healthy fruit if you won't root out the poison within the tree. And this includes work to address slavery and its legacy, because we never have. Slavery was a system of theft. It was theft of life as people were stolen, enslaved, and brutalized. Slavery was a theft of property through forced labor. It was the theft of identity and home as people were repeatedly ripped from the community and culture that are central to human experience. It was theft of happiness, of dignity and potential. And slavery became imprinted into the DNA of the nation and remains the foundation of racial inequality. Today, we see the vestiges of slavery in mass incarceration and mass criminalization. We see it in police violence and brutality. The systems that replaced slavery are all operating in the same vein. They have adapted, as racism always has, but their work is the same. And one example that we keep repeatedly talking about, and I've mentioned many times today, is policing and public safety. Black communities deserve effective and just public safety. But as we all know, the Black community's relationship with policing has always been fraught. That isn't a flaw in the system, it's endemic to its design. From their inception, police have been tasked with protecting power and privilege, often by exerting control over Black people and enforcing racial order. Modern policing has its roots in suppression of slave revolts and the creation of patrols to capture enslaved people who had escaped. Police were not the only tool of control of formerly enslaved people. Every element of our criminal legal system was brought to bear. Even as chattel slavery ended, Black people were pulled back into forced labor through convict leasing systems. Communities created categories of crime or sometimes just ignored it altogether and recommitted Black people into forced labor, having courts sentence them to forced labor. And during Jim Crow, police forces throughout the South brutally enforced segregation and joined lynch mobs. During the civil rights movement, police officers beat protesters who marched for equality. And police were enlisted to ward off residential integration and to protect the people who terrorize Black families. Today, we're still too often using police as tools to subjugate, control, regulate, surveil, and devalue Black people and other people of color. And I'm sure that many of you have heard over and over again that this moment calls for a radical rethinking and transformation of our public safety system, and wonder what that means. For me, true transformation would mean that police are not the only resort for addressing harm. It means removing police from enforcement of low-level offenses that should not be criminalized in the first place. Today, in communities of color, we have defunded education, we've defunded affordable housing, defunded public transit and environmental safety. We have divested from the things that would make our communities truly healthy, happy, and safe. So true transformation would mean investing in the resources and institutions that will allow all of our communities to thrive. Affluent white communities already live in a world where they choose to fund youth, health, housing, and education as their primary investment in community safety and happiness. I'm sure many of you live in communities like those. I live in a community like that. And these communities have lower crime rates, not because they have more police, but because they have more resources to support the health and well-being of their community in a way that reduces crime. They don't criminalize their children. They design their own lives so that they walk through the world without having much interaction with the police at all. And what we need to do is to identify and unravel the bias that leads us to believe that the same is not possible in communities of color. We are using the police to manage the problems that our unequal system has created. And instead, we have to invest in meeting those challenges head on. In order to transform an institution, we have to wrestle with the racism that's underneath it and that's built into it. And of course, policing and public safety are not the only example. It's just one that is repeatedly in the headlines. Second, I think we need to eliminate the barriers to full participation in our political process and to protect our democracy. Democracy is fragile and we have to fight to protect it each and every day. If the right to vote is the foundation of our democracy, I think we all have to acknowledge that that foundation is crumbling. We are seeing a systematic state-by-state assault on voting rights. We've seen over 350 voter suppression bills in 47 states, cutting early voting, cutting vote by mail, cutting polling locations in minority communities, enacting voter purges and strict voter ID laws. What we are seeing today, I think, is heartbreaking and it is disgraceful, but it's also totally predictable. The reaction to increasing political participation by people of color has always been a wave of voter suppression efforts. If you look at the 2008 election as an example, that election was the first presidential election in American history in which voters of color were 1/4 of the nation's eligible electorate. And the election saw a massive shift in the racial composition of early in-person voting, with Black voters casting their votes early in person more frequently than white voters. And the result was unprecedented efforts to cut back early in-person voting in states around the country, and voter ID laws and voter purges. And that's what we're seeing again today, that same cycle. Since the founding of our democracy, Black voters and other voters of color have had to overcome relentless efforts to block us from casting our ballots. And while the 15th Amendment was adopted in 1870 and prohibited denial of the right to vote on account of race or color, and of course, women were not included in that, in reality, Black people who wanted to exercise their right to vote were intimidated, beaten, and sometimes killed. Those brutal efforts were followed by literacy tests and poll taxes and grandfather clauses. So the fight to keep people of color from voting started with outright denial and brutality, and it evolved into creative and ingenious methods to deny, dilute, and suppress the right to vote. We did have a period of relatively robust participation, but then there was retrenchment, as there always is. And although there are no more literacy tests and grandfather clauses, today we see a new generation of retrenchment and tools being employed across the country. Again, discriminatory redistricting and annexation plans. We see voter identification laws and verification laws, voter purges, at-large election schemes, prohibitions on providing assistance to voters who are waiting in line for hours, 6, 7, 8, 9 hours to vote. Traditionally, we framed it as a fight to protect access to our democracy. Now, the fight really is to protect our democracy, both protecting access to those who have been traditionally marginalized and excluded, but really shoring up our democracy for everyone. As they say, democracy is a threat to white supremacy. So white supremacy is a threat to our democracy. In so many areas of civil rights and civil liberties, we are fighting a battle of ideas. But that doesn't mean anything if those who currently have and exercise disproportionate political power are able to use that power across the country to systematically disenfranchise people of color. Not only does it erect barriers to political participation, it will have the effect of further discouraging people from participating in the political process. And that is how democracies die. When people believe that they don't have any political power, and even worse, when they may in fact be right. The impacts of this inequity in voting cause real harm every single day. The most vulnerable communities are being targeted on multiple fronts, first with attacks on their right to vote, and then the resulting disenfranchisement leading to attacks on their privacy, their safety, bodily autonomy, and their First Amendment rights. So rather than engage with conversations about structural racism, we have a wave of lawmakers seeking to silence individuals, educators, and young people. And 2021 set a record for the most anti-LGBTQ bills passed during a legislative session. Over 100 anti-LGBTQ laws were proposed in 35 states, with these bills overwhelmingly targeting trans and non-binary youth. And this has not stopped at all in 2022. And following historic protests for racial justice, the right to protest is under fresh assault, and laws are being deployed to threaten constitutionally protected rights to petition the government for redress. Peaceful protests by people of color and allies for racial justice have always been a potent force to drive reform and transformation of discriminatory systems. It is a powerful reminder of the power in our communities, the strength in our communities. So it's not surprising today that the right to protest is under fresh assault and that the law is increasingly employed to threaten constitutionally protected rights. We absolutely should celebrate the power of protest, but we also have to attend to the real threats to those rights. Recently, we've seen a wave of anti-protest bills introduced across the country, and this trend follows something that we saw beginning in late 2016, when we started to see a nationwide trend of anti-protest bills targeting the most impactful protests in recent memory. And those were the Black Lives Matter activists calling for an end to police violence and police killings, Indigenous and environmental justice protesters demanding an end to pipeline construction. And every year since then, there has been a wave of such bills. And over the past year, it's really taking on an incredible clip. And it's no coincidence that these bills were introduced by politicians who harshly criticize the Black Lives Matter movement. It's clear they're aiming to shut down political speech they disagree with. It's a direct attack on our First Amendment rights, in addition to an attack on the movement for racial justice. And again, the current tsunami of these laws is perhaps not surprising, as it followed a time of historic protest in which millions of Americans joined together to protest the continued killing of Black people and other people of color at the hands of police. But nevertheless, the trend remains deeply troubling, undemocratic, and in most instances, unconstitutional. Next, I think we need to focus on building prosperity. Gaps in wealth between Black and white households expose accumulated inequality and discrimination, as well as differences in power and opportunity that can be traced back to the nation's inception. Economic justice and racial justice are two sides of the same coin. Economic justice work is critical because it supports our ability to access and enjoy other civil rights and civil liberties. As Dr. King said, what does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't have enough money to buy a hamburger? Racial justice requires stable jobs and incomes. It requires affordable housing and access to basic financial services. People of color still face barriers to accessing the mainstays of an economically vibrant life. Some of the things that all of us take for granted, access to a bank in our neighborhood. And we have to challenge that inequality. We need to increase access in order to level the playing field so that every person can achieve their highest potential. We must ensure access to the tools necessary to thrive. This includes expanding high-speed internet access, eliminating barriers to reentry, and challenging algorithmic bias. And importantly, it must include a real challenge to segregation. I think people tend to kind of focus on these other issues. None of this is going to change. Policing will not change. Inadequate education will not change unless we address segregation. The systems this country has so effectively built to protect and maintain segregated communities has a tremendous negative impact on those who are left out, because you cannot separate the places people have access to from the opportunities that people have access to. Our home, not only the physical residence, but also the community in which it's located, impacts our lives in numerous and interdependent ways. There is nothing that place does not touch. Our access to education and jobs and healthcare, our physical safety, our health, our access to healthy food, our social networks, the quality of the air we breathe, even the nature and number of contacts we have with police, all are deeply impacted by where we call home. And finally, I think it's important that we fight against justice by geography. We are only as strong as our individual parts, and as a country, we are only as strong as our individual states. There is work we all have to do to make sure that we all rise together, to build a future where we, the people, means everyone, everywhere, can access their fundamental rights, regardless of where they live. Where everyone, everywhere can live a life of dignity and respect, a choice-filled life. Justice by geography has been a part of America's story from the very beginning. Place and space have long decided whether one is free or faces injustice, whether one has access to opportunity, and the truth is clear today as it has ever been. Our country's union is barely being held together, and the nation's past and present are being mapped across regional lines. We really do live in two Americas in so many ways, and geography increasingly determines whether one receives the full rights of citizenship and belonging, the right to vote, the right to make healthcare decisions, and the right to marry who you love could be decided by whether you live in California or Arkansas, Florida or Illinois. A 10-year-old girl from Ohio was forced to travel across state lines to access abortion care because of the state's abortion law. Black voters stood in the baking sun for hours to vote in a Senate race simply because they lived in Georgia. Parents of trans kids have to uproot their families from Texas to access healthcare without being a target of investigation for child abuse because they live in Texas. We have to map a future where trans youth can be who they are regardless of where they live. We can see a future where everyone has equal access to the ballot. Our country needs more voices heard, not fewer. And we know, and I know, that the road forward is not simple, and true freedom, true inclusion, true equality will not be given easily. It will take every bit of ingenuity, every member of our community to ensure that we continue to move forward. Progress will be halting, as it always is. For every 2 steps forward, we can expect to take 1 step back. Progress will always be met with retrenchment, and it will require agitation. Sitting by quietly and silently is not going to get us where we need to be. Frederick Douglass told us, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet deprecate agitation are men who want crops without plowing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. Today, the fight for freedom takes thunder and lightning. The fight for freedom and racial justice is going to require the ocean's awful roar. Toward the end of his poem, Langston Hughes makes a promise, and I think it's a promise that we are all called upon every day to embrace. America, oh yes, I say it plain. America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. Today, in the climate that we live in the country that we live in, we are all called upon to renew this pledge, to do the work necessary to make America be America. Thank you for listening. I think we have time if anyone has a question or two. And thank you so much. I appreciate y'all.
No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sorry to point, I don't know anyone's name.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. It was so thoughtful and very inspiring.
Thank
You so rarely get cases like this in a law school institution. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about making sure that the histories that you're talking about are being told in either community spaces or law school institutions, especially as CRT has kind of been under attack, and how, if you have any thoughts and advice on if someone is ready to persuade institutions.
I think we can't separate what people consider to be traditional legal skills and legal training from the other skills that are actually necessary to affect change. So something that one of the classes I teach at the Civil Rights Clinic, and a critically important component of the seminar and the education that my students receive is about narrative change work. How we change the stories that are told, because that really perpetuates inequality in a way that I think lawyers haven't thought about before. You take a complaint and you think, I'm just going to tell the cold facts. No, it's an opportunity to tell the story, to repeat that narrative. We should be finding spaces to tell those stories and tell those narratives. I do it in my scholarship. If you pull up articles that I've written, I try to tell the complete story so we understand that these laws and these policies don't work in a vacuum. And as more and more of us push, I think we're going to see changes in legal education. We're certainly seeing changes in practice. The ACLU has a chief communications officer, and we call her our chief storyteller. And her work is critically important to the work that we do. And this is probably well beyond your question, but I'm chatty, so I'm going to do it. I'm going to chat. At one point, we at the ACLU did focus groups and found that people really just did not respond to the pro-choice versus pro-life. And we started to tell the story differently and talk about forced pregnancy. And now that is a language that's being used. It told a different part of the story to talk about forced pregnancy. We are engaged in a project. We were helping to elevate and amplify the voices of trans folks, just talking about trans joy and trans life. So it is not all about, the story is just not all about bans on participating in sports or restrooms. It is about understanding the full lives of people who are impacted by our laws and policies. And that's work that lawyers need to do and that we should push to do. I'm not trying to make trouble for Dean Johnson, but you should, make sure there are opportunities in your law school to learn how to use narrative and storytelling in conjunction with traditional legal skills.
I also want to say thank you so much for coming. I think it's so important to just recenter ourselves and the reason that so many of us are in law school and just sort of, face or ground ourselves in this reality. I think that can sometimes be erased in these law school spaces. But that's all to say, sometimes I think it can feel very overwhelming with how you have, showed us and reminded us how racism is really in every aspect of life. Sort of how do you choose where to put your time and energy, and how do you sort of use that knowledge and power, and sort of how have you done that in your life to sort of feel like you're actually working towards doing something impactful with your time and energy?
And that's a tough question. I feel overwhelmed and exhausted in this time, just as other people do, and I think we shouldn't pretend that this time is not overwhelming. I think even those of us who are incredibly committed to justice can feel like justice is impossible in these times. And I think how I've gone through, and this may simplify, is just to kind of stay in my lane, to recognize that we are all doing this together. Law professor John Powell says that we all can be a part of the circle of human concern. And for me, that means that we all can, take our interests, our skills, and do what we can, and that together we can move the needle towards justice. So I encourage people to figure out whatever way you can to be a part of this conversation. Some of us will be able to and be in a position to devote our entire public lives to it, our entire professional life to it. And some people will not be able to do that. And I don't judge anyone who cannot spend all their days or their entire career fighting for this work. But if you can, when you can, please join us. And that may mean financial support. I don't balk at the financial support. None of this work is possible without the financial support. The litigation that we engage in, it's millions of dollars, supporting community-based organizations, millions of dollars they need to be able to do the work every single day. And so support that way. If you have 12 hours of pro bono work that you can do at your firm, use those 12 hours in the most impactful way that you can. If you're an artist, then use your art to help advance the story, to engage in narrative change. After the killing of George Floyd, I think we saw so much movement because everyone in the community came together in the ways that they could. They were activists who were on the ground, ready for direct action, training people to be involved in direct action. There were lawyers who had litigation ready to go. There were lawyers that had legislation drafted from years and years ago, ready to go for this moment. There were people who had done films and written books, all ready to go for this moment. What we should be doing right now, as is our window of opportunity is closing or has closed, is get ready for the next opening. So when the window opens again, all of us are ready in whatever way we can, with whatever skills we have, with whatever time we have, to help push through that window and to advance more change.